Oh boy.
All
right.
Like, well, this might be done. Close that account.
I'll just put my laptop here.
Okay.
I'm watching you.
Damn it.
Hands.
All right. So I've got the ZF2 skeleton application remaining here, which has just information about the project and basically how to kind of get started. The ZF2 kind of recommendation is just clone the skeleton application. You can use Composer to create a project based on that repo. So once you have that project on your home directory, you can just do Composer update to get all the packages. And if you don't have Apache up and running, you can use PHP's built-in server. And you can just kind of point it at your public folder and get ticking away. When you're ready to move on, you can set up like Apache or Nginx to host that for you. So I kind of wanted to talk about the project structure for ZF2. That's kind of, you need to know your way around so that you can start making changes. It's got two pieces of configuration that you need to be aware of. It's the system configuration, which kind of boots up the pre-system for how it's going to find modules, and there's some other various mechanics that most people don't need to worry about. The defaults are pretty okay. But whenever you do add new modules, you're going to come in here and update the modules that are loaded. One of the, I guess, mantras of Zend is like write reusable modules. So a lot of people are like just adding code into their application directory structures, but they want you to say, hey, I want to make this containable thing that I can, maybe give away to other people. There's a website, ZF2modules.com, which a lot of people are publishing their packages to. So you can go there if you are like, oh, I wonder if there's a user management module that I can steal and not have to do myself. In addition to the modules that you're going to be loading, you can also specify your configuration options, like where you're looking for those modules, and also how you're going to be looking for configuration files within your project. ZF2 likes to give you, it's very much configuration powered. So a lot of your time is just going to be wiring configuration. But to that point, you can kind of get away with overloading by replacing a configuration that an existing module has already provided to supply your own concrete implementations or configuration options for adapters and whatnot. I said whatnot.
Drink.
So that's the system configuration. There's also the application configuration. There's kind of the notion of global and local configuration. Global is the configuration that you kind of ship, and that's public and everybody can kind of see it. It's where you put your default values. And the local configuration is where you put your overrides, passwords, and specific things to your environment, your stack. Opposed to doing like, oh, I'm going to make a production environment and a test environment and whatnot, you should be able to control that through the local config. So what's in your local config is what's defining whether or not you're hitting production services or staging or test services. In the system configuration, you can specify the names of the configuration files that you're going to look for. By default, it's looking in config autoload and then something.global.php or something.local.php. But you have control of this. You can use your own naming convention if you prefer. Most of the work for the application is confined to modules. So in the root directory, you're going to have this module folder. It ships by default with this application module, which is basically you're starting, hey, I'm Zend Framework. You're ready to get started. Whenever you create a new module, you can either do it by hand or you can use the ZF tool. ZF tool will do some nice things for you. It will create the directory structure for the module, which is basically just a folder under the module that's named after your namespace. It's got a config folder, a source folder. It'll create the module.php for you. Module.php is kind of your bootstrapping starting point for each module. Within the module PHP, you kind of define where you get the configuration or actually get in the configuration for the module. You can do things like how the autoloader is configured. There's Zen lets you cache configuration of your merged modules, but there's some configurations that you don't actually want to cache. And so in the module, you have entry points where you can basically escape the caching. This gets loaded every time instead of from cache. Module merging. So for every module that your application is going to use, in this case, I've got two modules. I've got the application module, which shipped with the skeleton application, and the album module, which I added for the Spotify example. During the bootstrap process, it's going to look at your system configuration for all the modules that exist, and then it's going to go look in your module paths for those modules. For each module it finds, it's going to load the module class. It's going to call getConfig, which should return the configuration specific to that module, and then it merges it all together. At the end, it takes all of the merged configurations, which just basically should be returning a array. It will merge it all together, and in the service manager, which is your DI container for ZF2, it will put under the alias config this configuration. So if you need it, if you're like, oh, I wonder what I put under this key, you can go to that service and then read the config just as an array. After the module merging occurs, it then goes and looks for local overrides. So the loading process, I believe, is it looks for the global configuration in your autoloader folder, and it gets these default values. Then it does your module merging to get all the module default values, and then it comes back and it looks for your local configuration, and it merges that on top of everything that's gone so far. So this lets you basically provide your passwords and overrides. Just as an example for the ZF tool to create a module, it's a pretty simple command. You just do create module and then the module name. And that'll come in here in the module directory, and it will create your module that you specified. Here's your project settings, and then the module configuration. Basically, it's all pretty standardized. You can come in here and start adding the configurations you need. After that, the ZF2 also lets you do things like create controllers and create actions on controllers. But after that, it's kind of useless. It's not as powerful as like the Laravel tools or the Symfony tools. Because there's a lot of configuration that comes after you actually create the files that you're going to use. As an example, if I want to create a controller for this test foo module, you specify the name of the controller that you want to create and then the module name that you want to create that controller in, or the other way around. Declaration says script, or you break it like I did. All right, well, the tool is not very great. What it will do if it runs, it will create in your source controller a controller file. That's great. You can start putting in your controller logic, but there's nothing directing the request to that controller at this point. In order to get requests mapped to your controller, you have to specify router configurations. So I'm just going to delete this because this is useless. And back to album, I've got controller here. I did everything for this project in the search controller. It's pretty light. But in order to get requests to actually hit the search controller, I had to provide router specifications. So in the module configuration for this project, I've got several sections. There's a lot of wiring going on here to make sure that everything is talking to each other. The first, I would say your starter point for your configuration is your router definition. With ZF2, it's a bit more verbose that you have to configure. With Symfony and Laravel, you really just kind of see some registration of a URI that looks like that and directly to whatever your controller is. Here you have a little bit more flexibility in that you're specifying the type of router that you're going to use. There's like tree stack, there's a bunch of different ones that are available. And they have various things that are useful. You have like a literal route, which is, it doesn't have any parameters. It's just, oh, I recognize this one word. You can do things like you can specify the domain as part of that route so that it will only match foo.myproject.com. So you can piece together these routes. We're using the tree route stack. You can piece together, oh, I want to use a scheme router with a domain router with a segment router. And that will lock you in so you can only match HTTPS myproject.com/album, whatever. Typically, my usage is usually just a segment route, gets it done for you. So in this case, I'm specifying a URI endpoint. It's got a controller action value and then an ID value. And you can specify constraints for the parameters of the route. You can say, all right, action has to be matching this regex pattern. ID has to be matching this. You can also specify defaults for those values as well. So if there isn't one specified, it will use that value instead. It's common to have a controller parameter in your route. I think the ZF2, the default application, has one of those available so that you can basically do rapidly. You can rapidly add controllers, and there's a master route that will let you get to that controller by just saying /foo/bar gets me to controller foo action bar. So when you define your router, part of the parameter that you're specifying all the time is the controller that route's going to route to. With ZF2, it's pretty common to use an alias for the actual controller class that you're going to use. You don't have to, but it's pretty common. The alias is then used to extract an instance of the controller from the controller plugin manager. The controller plugin manager is basically an isolated DI service container. When you are routing a request, there was a security issue with ZF2 where it was possible to get unexpected services out of the container because of the routing. So they went and they took controllers and they made them their own special kind of like a whitelist of things that you had to be able to, you had to be in this whitelist in order for the route to instantiate that controller and bring it up. So in the configuration, there's a controller section, and this is where you list the controllers that are available for routing. With your configuration, you can have several different ways to create an instance of a controller. You can do it through a factory. A factory is a class that will create an instance of a controller and return it to you. You can have an evocable, which is just going to instantiate whatever class you've registered. You can have an abstract factory, which will kind of match kind of like a wildcard alias and give you an instance based on some configuration or something. Typically, you're going to use factories for your controllers. You might be using abstract factories if you've got a master pattern that you're kind of satisfying. You'll see that when we do app agility demonstration next go around. You also have the service manager configuration. Service manager is ZF2's DI container. You basically register a bunch of methods for creating dependencies against aliases or class names. You have aliases, invocables, factories, abstract factories, and delegators are mechanisms that you can use to provide dependencies. When you have a controller, by default, you can extend this abstract action controller that's in provides. It has a helper method called getServiceLocator. And so what they usually kind of do by default is instruct you to do this getServiceLocator, then get, and you specify the dependency or the service that you're trying to get. And so you're pulling it out of the DI container, but that's not really a great pattern. It's better if you specify a getter for your, sorry, a setter for your service and the dependency required, and then configure your factory that's providing that instance to get that dependency out of your service locator and inject it into the instance. For example, there's the search controller factory. This factory is responsible for creating an instance of search controller. It receives an instance of the DI container, and basically it pulls out an album service which this controller needs, and it injects it into the search controller, and then it returns that search controller. So this is kind of the pattern that you want to utilize with ZF2, is keep all of your container actions within factories instead of within the actual like business logic that you're implementing.
What's the argument for using setters instead of constructor parameters?
You can use either, but with constructor parameters, you need to use DI, Zen's DI container. Zen provides two DI methods. It's got Zen DI and Zen Service Manager. DI is the one that does constructor parameters automatically for you, but you have to register types with the dependencies that are provided. It's just a bit more configuration. It offers a default DI factory to Service Manager for you. It's just, I think that's just how you go about configuring it. So in my module configuration, I've registered a route called /album, and I've registered a controller album controller search, and I've configured the search controller factory to provide that controller. When I go to my application, if I go to, oh, I did something. Test food could not be initialized, right? When I use the controller to add the module, it inserted into my system config. So since I've deleted, I got to get rid of it. So when I go to the endpoint /album, that's going to be directing it to my search controller. I've got two actions here. I've got an index action, which is where I'm choosing to display the search form and also display the initial search results if there's been a search. So just to demo it out, so what I'm checking is I'm checking the request that was associated with this route, and I'm saying, hey, was post specified? And if so, I grab the post and I send it into a form. ZF2 has a lot of components as part of the framework. One of those components is the form component. It allows you to basically describe what your form looks like using elements and what am I looking for? Form elements as groups, so that you can say, all right, if I have a model, say an album, and I want to use it in this form, I can define that as basically a sub-element, and then I can create a bunch of different forms and use that element again in those different forms without having to redefine all the fields that make up that model. I didn't actually do it in this example, but you can use form collections to basically bind a DTO or a model to the form, so that when you inject the data into the form and you validate it, instead of having to go and get the data from the form, it automatically binds the form values to the model that you've bound to the form. That's a more advanced usage, but there's documentation available at Framework, Zen's website to get that. So for the flow here, I basically just check to see if there's a request. I submit it into the form. The form's pretty simple. It's just basically a search field. that's got an album name text input and a submit input. I specify that there's it's using the method post to submit the form. In the view, I think I'm using there's a view helper that actually renders forms for you. So you can just like, oh, I don't really want to deal with it. I just want to render the whole thing. It's also got row helpers, so you can just render a single input at a time. It also supports decorators, so that you can actually change the HTML that's around the forms. It provides input validation. It provides error management. So if there's an error during validation, if you provide the form back to the view, it will display with the errors being displayed on the page. After I asked the album service for search results for this request, I then basically pack those results into a view model. With ZF2, you can return either a response, or you can return a view model, and it will handle the necessities of like rendering that for you. ZF2 provides a layout component, which will let you specify basically an overall rendering strategy, or not rendering strategy, an overall layout with a couple of variables that you can access to put content into. Let's see here. For example, this is the basic layout of the site. This chunk right here is for where content that's rendered in the controller action will actually be displayed. The rest of it is just static, basically, for the rest of the site. Each application, or each controller action can have its own view. So for instance, this is the application module. Sorry, let me get back to album. In the search controller, I've got two views. I've got the index view, which just has basically my search form, and I'm using the form element helper here to render the album. And then if I have results in the view variable albums, it will iterate through each one of those and basically display the list. Let's take a look at the album service. The album service is pretty similar to the Symfony and Laravel projects. There's just a couple of slight tweaks for the implementation specific to the Zen framework. I basically gave the service 4 dependencies, which is a little high, but I just wanted to demonstrate a couple patterns that ZF2 offers. I'm using a Spotify API aware interface and trait, which provides my Spotify API service, which is what's actually going and getting the search results. And then I've also got these gateway dependencies. In order to persist album information, image information, and track information, I use the table gateway pattern. ZF2 is kind of like you're on your own for how you want to deal with persistence. If you want, you can use some components they provide, like table gateway, the DB adapter, row gateway, or you can say, I'm going to go with Doctrine. I think Doctrine is probably better. Well, it's definitely better. But for this example, I went ahead and I used the gateway just to kind of demonstrate those components. With the gateway, you kind of create basically a helper class that will take a model, extract the information out of it, and save it to your adapter. It uses the Zen's DB adapter component, which is what ZF2 uses for your DB abstraction layer. So for the search, this has kind of been seen twice already. We basically just ask the Spotify API to do a search. If we have it in our database already, it will just be returned from cache. Otherwise, it's got to go and get the information and persist to the database. I don't know that I want to explain all this again, but there's a couple things that I wanted to show for the actual models for the table gateway pattern. So here you can just create your model. This is my album model. I created a bunch of attributes for each of the properties that need to be persisted. And the gateway pattern requires this exchange array. This basically takes data and it pulls it out of an array and puts it into the attributes. This is what the table gateway is using when you give it a model when it tries to save. These are basically all just getters and setters. They're helper methods. You don't actually need them for the table gateway pattern that ZF2 is providing. I just add them there because I don't like to do public accessors against the actual model. I prefer the getters and setters. ZF2's got part of the service manager. It's got a delegator. It's got support for delegators. So that's how I implemented the cache layer here. The album service is what's actually fetching the data and persisting through the table gateway. But I use a delegator that wraps or proxies that album service so that before I actually go and hit the album service, I check the cache for that request. And if it's already in the cache, I'll pull it back. And if not, I'll do the album service. I'll get the response and I'll store it in cache. That's happening here in the delegator cache class. So basically, it's just it wraps the real Spotify API and checks cache before and after for that process. In this project, there's a lot of factories in association with the classes I provided. That's because I'm using the service manager factory pattern to provide that dependency. In the service manager, for example, I'm defining delegators here, and it's the key here is representing the service that you want to delegate, and then you specify the method that you want to provide the delegator or the factory that's providing that delegator. So I've already registered Spotify API up here as an invocable. So if you ask the service manager for a Spotify API, it's going to check first with the delegator. So, oh, hey, there's a delegator for Spotify API. So I'm going to use Spotify API cache factory. So that will bring me into the Spotify API cache factory. It provides me with the method it would have used to create an instance as a callback so that I can get the real Spotify service for myself and then wrap it however I want to please. What else? I want to open it up for questions.
So what do you use with unit testing with ZF?
You can use Doctrine or BHAT or any existing testing framework.
Have you used any?
Sorry?
Have you used any?
Yeah. PHP unit, we're using PHP unit at work. I've used BHAT before. Really, you should be doing your all of your business logic in classes that aren't necessarily attached to the framework. So it's pretty easy to test those components. When you want to actually test like maybe your endpoint configuration, whatnot, you can use the internal server to kind of spin up your application with a test config. That's one way to kind of do that.
When you're doing a lot of testing like that, do you find any issues with kind of how heavy config things are driven? Like, I mean, obviously with your design, it would be very easy to put in a new factory that gave you mock objects back for something.
Right.
But it's like the wiring to do that for a test seems like it would be a little painful.
Yeah, you should be able to hopefully for your BHAT test, you really just need to say, like for your functional test, I'm sorry, you really need to reconfigure your database adapter because you want to persist to, a test schema.
Sure.
For feature testing, yeah, there's potentially a lot of configuration you got to change to match the environment. Hopefully you're using your config in a way where you can kind of call out all those specific variables that are environment specific, so that it's not hunt and peck for like all the things I need to change. ZF2 does have capabilities for token parsing in config so that you can use keywords. There's some people that don't really like that, but that's one possibility to kind of help extract the variables that are more significant for testing.
For unit testing, the bootstrapping is actually really easy so long as you've done a pretty good job writing solid code. Like if you're separated your concerns pretty well, you should be able to test each one of your classes separately without anything. In fact, a good paradigm we found for Zen framework at work is to not actually write your code in the modules, but just use the modules as a DI connector, similar to like Symfony bundles and agnostic packages.
Right.
That way, you're managing your code coverage separately for each one of your functional business logic packages, and then just connecting it to the framework.
Very true.
What about configuration changing based off of the environment? So the difference between your dev environment and production, how do you switch your configuration?
We do that utilizing like your local configuration. So the difference between your dev, your test, your staging, whatever, is basically the config that you put in local.php. So when you're distributing your application or your module, only the things that are in global are going with it. The local.php is usually something that you keep in that environment specifically, and it's added to your ignore, to your get ignore, so it doesn't get added to the repository. So whenever you check out, you just copy in your environment config that you want to use.
If you're using VMs for your functional and integration tests, a really great way, if you're close, if you're even started getting toward like a 12-factor app, using actual environment variables to do your environment config is way easier to test.
What about any specific kind of bindings with Zen server that makes it, like if you're going to use Zen server, it's worthwhile to use Zen framework because anything like that?
I'm sure there are, but we don't use, like we have Zen server, we're using the community edition, but we don't actually utilize it, right? It's just like, oh, that's the thing that delivers the Zen framework library when we first started. And so like, oh, we went through the install, but like we're not utilizing actual Zen server, which is a shame.
What is Zen server?
Platform thingy? It's
more or less a prepackaged. It's not a VM, but it's a prepackaged set of like PHP extensions.
It's got like profiling
It's
stuff.
an optimizer. Yeah, it comes bundled with the profiler that you have to turn on otherwise.
Right, and a bunch of
caching.
it has a bunch of monitoring features that hook into the profile and things like that, so you can have it automatically run profiles based on slow performance triggers on paths and stuff like that. And that's kind of what the feature set they sell it on. Not used on production, but those are the, if you're going to use it, those are the big features.
Yeah, on production, you're probably using like New Relic or Loggly anyway.
They want you to be using their software. I mean, they've got a lot of features in there for like, oh, if your request is over 2 seconds long, we do a trace for you. You can find those bottlenecks. So I think they basically kind of want to be the built-in New Relic kind of thing for PHP. But I don't know how many people are actually using it as opposed to New Relic.
Similar to that Symfony or Sensio like launched Blackfire not long ago that does a similar service for tightly integrated with Symfony.
Yeah, but there's definitely a lot of room for those services because the big guys like New Relic are super, super inefficient. So like just getting rid of New Relic on your setup is a good way to get 15, 20% performance.
Yeah.
Right.
Their
So,
extension is pretty slow.
that's why you're seeing so many people trying to tackle that space because New Relic is just a hog. I
was going to mention there in the main project directory, there's a public folder. This is where your assets go for CSS and images and JavaScript. If you're going to be developing modules as kind of the mantra is to be reusable, you might have assets that need to be distributed with that. Like, oh, I'm making a user management. Maybe I want user icons and stuff distributed with this module. You need to use another module like maybe Aesthetic to actually cope with the fact that those files will be packaged in your like a module subfolder within your vendor instead of your public directory.
Is there like a JavaScript helper to help you connect all the JavaScript in those modules?
Yeah.
At the bottom of your view, you were calling like a JavaScript helper.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the one of the many components that Zen provides are basically just a boatload of view helpers. You've got headlink, which lets you generate your A hrefs and A links. You've got base path, which gives you basically kind of your the URI that you're starting with, your home directory. You've got helpers for your title, metadata. You've got URL helpers. There's navigation helpers. There's a bunch of stuff to help you kind of like pull in these disparate pieces and pipe them in line with your view output.
Is there anything built in to help you publish a web API, like a JSON feeder, something of the sort?
I would, in the way, yes, App Agility is for helping you do that kind of thing. App Agility.
Okay.
The lead developer of Zen Framework transferred, he's now the lead developer for the product owner of App Agility, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's like a data connector that turns ZF Framework projects into RESTful APIs.
Okay.
Next one.
Next one.
Okay.
So you find that kind of the module mantra pays off? It sounds like you were kind of saying that you actually go with the pattern of kind of writing standalone libraries to do things, and you're just using ZF to manage the view layer, I guess, of the connections.
So
Or
for us, it largely means like, the difference is, are you doing product development or are you doing rapid prototype development? Like product development, if your project is going to live through multiple frameworks, then definitely separate it out and just use the framework DI connectors as connectors so you can manage those packages through iterations of your code. If you're just doing a rapid prototype app, keep it as simple as possible would be my recommendation.
I found some of the modules that are pre-existing very useful, like ZFC user and ZFC MVC auth. These things are kind of used and play with App Agility. They're really well written packages, and they do well with abstracting the data layer from the actual model so that you can override like the user model with the things you care about, and it works with it. It doesn't break because you want to use your own thing. So I like the idea. I think writing modules for your application makes sense.
It breaks down when you start using like really domain-specific modules.
Right.
Like, our company is the Nerd. We do a ridiculous amount of Symfony 2 development, and the mantra with Symfony 2 launch was bundle. And since that's now a documented anti-pattern for Symfony. Like unless it's a highly transferable thing like a user system or an ACL system, or unless it's something you find yourself doing on project after project after project, a bundle is a lot. Right? Like if you sell widgets, but nobody else sells widgets, probably a widget bundle is probably okay.
Are these modules distributed as composer packages? You use composer to collect them?
Yeah, if you're familiar with the way that bundles are done in Symfony, they're essentially it's essentially a way to expose agnostic code to the DI lifecycle of an application. So like what he's got here, really done implementation of it is he's got a whole bunch of factories and services that honestly could live well outside of Zen Framework.
Right.
But he connects them to Zen Framework with Zen Framework's factory instances, which even there's an interface for Zen Framework 2 that makes that possible. That's the connector, like that's how you wire the dependencies together to bootstrap everything up together. From that from that premise, yeah, absolutely. In fact, like I'd be willing to bet that there's probably a Guzzle Zen module on ZF
Sitting on your
modules.
vendor.
It's not a Zen module. It is just a composer package that we're utilizing.
Well, I mean, like on ZF modules that like the ZF module repository system you mentioned, there's probably somebody who put together. Like,
Oh, right.
Guzzle,
Yeah.
There actually is, because I saw it was just updated for Guzzle 6.
Yeah. So
Right,
like,
so it's just adding, the module just has.
it just wraps the service, which like if you think of it, like that's all you need to do.
Right.
Like, it's the same thing. So if you write agnostic code, like Guzzle wrote agnostic code, then you can also publish Guzzle bundle and the Guzzle module and repurpose that same code across the multiple frameworks.
Yeah. That's all I got.
Thanks.
Well, we got a bunch of people here. Any thoughts about moving the group closer to like downtown Tempe?
That's for me.
Downtown Tempe is a parking nightmare, Tempe, or
We would have parking.
on Tuesday? I would never go to Tempe because I hate the parking situation.
What's
Where's-
downtown
where's
Tempe?
specific?
Like,
Like
where do
Beaver
we?
Mill,
Oh,
like
man.
University-ish.
Okay.
There's like a government building there that I was looking at, or I'm going to be looking at.
That's on the train ride home.
I mean, I don't hear any blatant no's.
He's talking about.
Use light rail.
It would be in that, I think it's in that transportation center, it's like right
Yeah.
there. Like the Tempe, like downtown transportation center thing, it is a train station, it's not like it's.
They have a nice big presentation room, supposedly.
Yeah, that works for me.
Ride for me,
Yeah,
so I was.
closer than this.
It works for me. It's way closer home and
What's up here?
I mean, I think in general, that's being more central is a
Oh,
lot.
sorry.
It's like super close to where we work, like walking, like we were just walking.
Yeah.
So, I'm on board.
Was it okay that I parked in the visitor parking? Because I've been there since 5.
That's where I park.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are they gonna do, kick you out?
Yeah, these guys I'm pretty sure just operate on chaos, like I think they have no rules.
Order in chaos.
Yeah, all their students are probably at the cosplay construction club right now.
What?
Whoa.
I'm missing that?
we should have canceled.
Wait, that's not us?
It's the reason, I needed help with my armor.
I'll go as DI, man.
So it looks like we had a couple of new people today. People I didn't recognize. Want to do a quick introduction before we head over and get some food and drinks?
Yeah, I'm sit next to you.
I guess I can start. This is my idea.
Is that where we're gonna start?
So Josh Icorn, I'm the CTO at Pagely, and I've been involved in the group for since
Long,
2000 now,
Yeah.
with just a 5-year gap when I didn't even live in Phoenix.
My name's Jay. I work for a ticketing software company, run the API stuff there. I've been in this group just a little less than Josh, I guess, with lots of absences in and out. Basically, yeah. I actually don't even write code anymore, so this is just my way of trying to pretend I'm still writing code.
My name is Justin. I moved down here 2 months ago. Came to the last meeting, but I work for a company out of Salt Lake City doing airline reservation system.
My name's Zach. I've been here before. Went to the Lauderdale meeting. I actually work for ASU Biodesign, and I do all the web development.
My name is Rupok Bali, and I'm working as a PHP freelancer. So,
I'm Doug Linsmeyer. I'm a principal software engineer with a company called Nerdery. I'm pretty new to the Valley, so I'm definitely new here.
I'm the anonymous lurker in the back, but you can call me Chris.
All right, I'm Gordon Forsyth. I supposedly run this thing. I work at Synapse Studios. We're just a group that does things for other people and hopefully well. I work with this guy.
Yeah, I'm Aaron. I work at the same company. We just build software for people. You guys just opened here, right?
Yeah.
I heard about that.
Midwest.
Yeah, we're from, our headquarters in Minneapolis, is where most of our staff is. Some of us are in Kansas City and Chicago, and then our newest expansion is here.
Sweet.
My name's Carl. I originally was part of this group. I think it started in '96. Then went to LA for a few years, started a startup there. Sold that one. Started a new startup in San Francisco. Just walked away from that one. So now I'm back in the Valley.
Hi, you guys must save the best for last. No, just kidding. My name is Q, and I used to live here in the Valley, and I moved home in Florida to be with family, and now I'm back. So I'm excited to be back in the Valley. And I currently am not employed for anyone. I'm an entrepreneur, but I do a lot of contract work if needed. And right now I'm just working on some projects and could use some more PHP.
And those that didn't hear at the beginning, Josh is looking for a PHP or a DevOps guy.
If you're interested or know anyone who is, let me know.
Sweet.
Awesome, man.
All right, so after this, we head over to Gallagher's, which is what's that, a